This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good evening, everybody. A rare thing to say here at the Institute. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to this special event. This week marks the 148th week of conflict in Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion. And this year we saw the likes of Ukraine's surprise attack in Kursk in August. We saw the arrival of North Korean troops. A little after, we saw Russia's incursion into Kharkiv in May, and of course the war grinds on. And with numbers disputed, the Wall Street Journal rather, in September claimed that up to 1 million people have been killed or injured. And I think President Zelensky acknowledged some 43,000 Ukrainians had been killed in the month of October. In the month of October, he acknowledged 43,000 people have been killed over the course of the conflict. And of course, many millions more have been displaced, traumatized. So we're here this evening to discuss Ukraine's fight for freedom with Lara Marlowe. Lara, a really sincere welcome here. The Institute, welcome back. We'll be discussing in part the contents of this wonderful book, How Good It Is, I Have No Fear of Dying, Lieutenant Yulia Mykytenko's fight for Ukraine, that Lara has just published with Head of Zeus here in Ireland. It's being published in America as well, or it has been published in America?
It will come out in February. Melville House in New York is publishing it, and it comes out in Berlin in February as well.
In translation?
In translation, just in time for the German election, and the publisher is very excited because Ukraine is a big issue in German politics right now.
Of course it is.
Why the Chancellor fell out with his finance minister over weapons to Ukraine. So
more on that anon, I hope. That the book it packs a lot into its 260 pages across 11 chapters. I've really enjoyed reading it, spending time with it. And the great John Banville in the praise, I already said this to you earlier, Lara said the book has the depth and breadth of a documentary and the subtlety and insight of a novel, which is beautiful prose and really high praise from one of the greats. So we say this a lot, but you don't require much introduction, I think, but just to keep with convention. Lara Marlowe has reported on more than a dozen wars and has won a wide range of press awards. And you'll know her, of course, from her Irish Times column. Pertinent to this discussion, Lara has spent, I think I'm right to say, 3 extended periods in Ukraine since the onset of Russia's war of aggression there in 2022, the extension, of course, of its previous invasion. And in 2006, it's worth mentioning that Lara was awarded the Légion d'honneur for service to Irish-French relations, so relations with our nearest EU member. So really great to have you back, Lara. Lara has, since I've been in office for a couple of years now, Lara's been with us a number of times, but always online, so it's a real pleasure to welcome you here. So the usual T's and C's apply. The discussion from now on, and from when I started speaking, is on the record. If you wish to participate in the discussion, those here, please raise your hand. And those online, you're very welcome. Please just put your question into the Q&A function on Zoom. I should say very quickly that Kieran there at the back of the room, representing Books Upstairs, has copies of the books for sale, I think for $23.95, is that right? Lara will be available afterwards to sign copies if anyone is interested. And indeed, if anyone online would like to purchase a signed copy, please send a message and we can arrange that and have it sent to you. Lara and I are going to talk for kind of 20-25 minutes. And I propose, Lara, I'm going to range across 4 predictable enough areas of questions. One will be on Lieutenant Mykytenko and those under her command and what you can tell us about their experience. A few questions perhaps on your process of writing as a writer. And then a couple of questions on the war now and its context before possibly, if permissible, to discuss how things might end. So with the first question, can I just ask how you came to know Lieutenant Mykytenko?
it was during my last trip to Ukraine for the Irish Times in August of 2023. And I wanted to do a newspaper story about women in the Ukrainian military. There are about 60,000 women, of whom 10,000 are in combat positions. And I contacted Veteranka, which is the women's sort of military organization, and they put me in touch with several women But Yulia was the one who really, really made an impression. I was in Kyiv with my interpreter. Is the sound okay? Because I'm getting it, it's kind of echoey for me, but as long as if it's okay for you, that's the important thing. I raced back. I'd spent the morning doing interviews, and I interviewed actually a Russian dissident who was involved in with sort of Russian militiamen who were attacking the Russians and so on. And I sort of said to Nazar, my interpreter, I said, well, so what do we have next? And he said, oh, it's the lady drone operator. And I said, oh, so we get back to the hotel, and this lovely young woman comes on the screen. She was wearing a khaki T-shirt and smiling and sitting in front of a ruined, sort of dilapidated house. And I said, oh, you're the woman drone operator. And she said, no, I am not. I am Lieutenant Yulia Mykytenko. I'm the commander of the platoon, of the reconnaissance platoon. I said, oh, sorry. And then we talked for nearly an hour. And when we turned off the computer, the Zoom link, I turned to Nazar and I said, what an extraordinary woman. I don't think I've ever met anyone so impressive in my whole life. Because she was very calm. She was very authoritative in the way she answered, but she was also, in a way, vulnerable. And her story was extraordinary. She had married a soldier whom she'd known for only 3 months in 2015, when she was only 20 years old. And then she joined the army the following year to be with him. And then 2 years after that, he was killed in a Russian bombardment. And then 2 years after that, her father self-immolated on the Maidan because he thought that Zelensky was capitulating to Russia because of the provisions of the Minsk Accords. They were dismantling some positions in Donbass, and they were giving up some territory to the Russians, and the Russians weren't reciprocating. And he wasn't alone. There were about 50,000 soldiers at the time demonstrating and saying no to capitulation. And his last words were, I want Ukraine to be independent. So she'd known all this tragedy, and she'd also lost about 20 of her closest friends. She'd played a very important role in the Maidan revolution in 2013-14. So it just struck me that her life had paralleled very closely the life of independent Ukraine since 1991. Well, she was born in 95, but she'd had all the same experiences as the country. And I wrote my article. It was a whole page in the Irish Times about women in the military. I went back to Paris, and I was looking, Jonathan, my wonderful agent who's sitting here on the front row, remembers I was planning to write a book that winter anyway, and I had 2 or 3 in mind. And then one morning, it just popped into my head, I must write a book about Yulia, because I was very engaged, very interested in Ukraine. So first, I think Jonathan was the first person I told, and he was quite keen. He went to Neil Belton, our publisher, and Neil was also very keen. Nazar, my interpreter in Lviv, was less keen. He thought it was going to be impossible. He thought the communications weren't good enough. And the idea I had was to do it by Zoom, to spend the winter with Yulia and Nazar on my laptop computer in Hoth. And that's what we did. And so between early November of 2023 and March of 2024, we spent about 24 hours together in sort of 2-hour segments. And I did a verbatim transcription of it. I taped everything of every interview. And at some point, I showed the first 6 chapters to my older brother, who said it was boring. And I was devastated. And then I realized I had to bring it to life. And so I decided to do more dialogue and more scenes, more description. I talked it over with Yulia, and she was fine with that. And I sent her every chapter as I wrote it, and she corrected a few things, but by and large, she was pretty happy with it.
Was that a conventional process for you?
No, in fact, I don't know of anyone who's written a book by Zoom, aside from myself. I mean, it's probably been done, but no, it was really unusual. And I wasn't sure it would work because little things kept going wrong. The first time, Yulia had a tank column going through her village, and she missed an appointment. And then the second time, she had a drone pilot who was killed. and she missed the appointment. And then the third time in February of this year, she just disappeared for about 2 weeks. And I was getting very, very worried about her. And so was Nazar, and we were preparing to contact her brother or something. And she resurfaced. She'd been in a basement shelter because they were just under constant shell fire by the Russians.
And where is she physically?
Physically, she's between, she's very near Liman, which if you look at a map of Ukraine to the far east, it's the upper part where Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast meet each other in the corner, very, very near to Russia. So that's where she is. I had about a week ago, she sent me a video of the village where she was stationed was hit by Uragan missiles. They're like Grad missiles. There's multiple missile launchers. And it's a very short video, less than a minute, but it just kind of pans around the village, and it looks like Gaza or something. I mean, it's and they had to move again. So she's moved her base camp 4 times since I started doing the book.
I'm keen to ask a little bit about what it's like for Lieutenant Mykytenko and those under her command, but just briefly, because you had mentioned, so she, as a very young woman, she was involved in the Maidan protests back in when she was a teenager, right? If I do my maths correctly.
She was 18.
18, yeah.
Yeah.
What drove her into that? Do you have any idea? Or was it just, I won't make any suggestions.
She grew up in a fairly typical Ukrainian family. Her parents divorced when she was a child. They were quite poor. Like everyone in Ukraine, the economic crisis of the 1990s was terrible. But her father managed to get her and her brother into a rather snobby school where everyone spoke Russian, and at home they spoke Russian. And then when she was 17, she was admitted to Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which is the oldest university in Ukraine, and which has, since independence in 1991, had the objective of raising awareness of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language, and where all the courses are in Ukrainian. And she found that extremely difficult at first, but she switched. She says, Ukrainian is my mother tongue. I learned it at 17. And she also, at Kyiv-Mohyla, joined or co-founded, really, a group called Vidsich, which means rebuff. And the rebuff is, of course, to Russia. And they were campaigning for Ukraine to join the EU, for Ukraine to join NATO. They were very, very Western-oriented. And even before the Maidan protests started, they were distributing pamphlets all over Kyiv against Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Russian stooge, really. And they were afraid that he would withdraw. Ukraine had been negotiating for, I think it was 4 years, an association agreement with the EU. And they saw it coming. They realized that Yanukovych was not going to sign the agreement. And so they were just, publishing or they were having photocopying, I suppose, thousands and thousands of these pamphlets, which they were distributing. And so it was very natural for them to join the Maidan protest as soon as those started.
So from pamphlets and kind of campaigning as a young woman in the Maidan protest to now she's commander of a platoon, as you say, really on the front line. Mm-hmm. Before discussing a little bit about her experience of the war and those around her, can you just say anything about the significance of drone warfare within the Ukrainian military? What sort of place does it hold?
It's very, very important for the Russians as well. And unfortunately, the Russians have more drones than the Ukrainians do. They have more of everything than the Ukrainians do. But it's totally changed warfare. I mean, they use very few tanks or armored personnel carriers or armored vehicles of any type because as Yulia says in the book, with a $500 drone, you can destroy a multi-million-dollar tank. And I know General Zaluzhny, who was the chief of staff at the time of the armed forces, he's now ambassador to London, gave an interview to The Economist just over a year ago, in which he said, we're in a stalemate. He said, technology has brought us to the point where nothing moves. And actually now it is moving. I'll get back to that. But most of the men getting killed are getting killed by FPV drones. And with the FPV drone, I don't know if you know, it's got this sort of visor here, and you see everything the drone sees. And they put grenades, or well, usually grenades, on the FPV drones, and then you just choose the person you want or the target you want and go in and crash into it and blow it up. And a lot of men are getting killed this way. In fact, the Russians are using FPV drones in Kherson for what they call human safaris. They're using them to kill civilians. It's pretty grim. But it kind of negates the value of all of this armor. But actually now, since the Ukrainians invaded Kursk in August, things have heated up a lot. And also, since I think Trump's election probably has something to do with it, that both sides want to grab as much territory as they can in case they have negotiations early next year. And they want to be in a position of strength. So they're fighting a lot harder these days. And especially the Russians are moving forward in Donbass and taking more territory, like the last village that Yulia was in.
I have a naive question that I kind of know the answer to, I think.
There's no such thing as a naive question.
You're very kind. But just regarding the fact that Yulia and those under her command are so close to the front line when it's been operated remotely. I think I do understand that the limits of the technology mean that you have to be within a certain proximity of the conflict, but can you comment on that at all?
Well, actually, I mean, they're close, but her base camp is about 15 kilometers from the gray zone. The gray zone is about 5 kilometers between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's kind of no man's land. It's full of mines, it's full of rats that eat the dead and wounded, and to do an assault, you have to cross the gray zone. So, then she has 2 dugouts. So she's 15 kilometers back. The dugouts are about 5 kilometers back. And she goes to the dugouts, and she sends her men to the dugouts. And the dugouts are very well camouflaged, so hopefully the Russians don't know where they are, don't see them, and they send their drones up from the dugouts. And she has usually 2 men in each dugout at all times, 24 hours a day, and then each man is handling a drone. So she's got 4 drones patrolling all the time. And she's watching the feeds from the drones. They do more work at night. She tends to go to bed about 3 in the morning because I guess for some reason the fighting takes place at night, under cover of night. And they're watching the Russian lines all the time. They're watching for signs of movement. And they see the Russians. Well, one incident she told me about this year, 2 Russian tanks came forward, and then about 20 men got out of the tanks, and then the tanks pulled back so they can't hit them with FPVs or other drones. And then the men come forward single file. And that particular incident, she called in the artillery, and there were about, she said there was a total of between 40 and 50 men. And I think she said they killed 12, and there were about 30 wounded, which is pretty high. The Russians take enormous casualties, higher than the Ukrainians. And then she said she claims that the Russians just abandon their dead and wounded much of the time, which the Ukrainians do not. But that's what's going on.
Before moving on from this topic, can you say anything? There's references to this in your book, to some of the things that Lieutenant Mykytenko and those around her have seen, some of the things that they've observed through their drones. Sure.
3 incidents come to mind. The first one was on September 9th of 2022. Captain Dmitro, who was her company commander, the company is 128 men, and he was leading an assault into a village that they had been shelling. And her company believed that the Russians had fled the village, and he was going into the village to make sure that it was free of Russians, which was very dangerous, of course. But he went into the village, and she was watching him on the drone feed, and a shell exploded where he was. And, all she saw was smoke. And so she saw her company commander, who she was very fond of, killed on the drone feed. The second very memorable one I remember was early 2023. They were fighting Wagner mercenaries who were in Soledar. You remember the salt mines of Soledar, very near Bakhmut. And she was watching the front lines, the infantry lines, and the Wagner mercenaries were just pouring over the top. They were just coming, just hordes of them. And the Ukrainians were gunning them down with machine guns and just killing, more. She said she couldn't even count them all. And she was quite shocked just to see this wholesale assembly line death of these Wagner soldiers. And then the perhaps the most chilling one, which she saw this summer, so after we had finished the book, I think it was in July or August, she was watching on a drone feed. The Russians found it wasn't her dugout, it was a different unit, but from the same company. They found the dugout and they threw tear gas into it. And the Ukrainians came out of the dugout and I think they made them strip or take off their shirts or something, and they lined them up, and then they just gunned them down. They killed them. It was 5 or 6 men all at once, and so that's pretty horrific. And it's known now that the Russians are particularly angry with or after drone pilots, because the drone pilots are taking the most casualties, and they also do not take prisoners anymore. So any men they catch on the front line like that, they just shoot them dead. It's summary execution, which is a war crime, of course.
Of course. And so Yulia, no doubt, Lieutenant Mykytenko, forgive me, has observed people belonging to her, people she knew in conflict. Okay.
It's really chilling. And,
It is chilling.
I ask her very often, I say, how can you stand this? How can you sleep at night? And she says, you just have to, it's like you take it and set it on a shelf somewhere, because if you think about it too much, you go mad. You can't cope.
You'd often wonder if that just happens. I've never experienced anything of this nature. So you wonder if that's the only way you can respond.
I think you have to keep a certain distance from it. And also you have to really believe in what you're doing.
And she does.
Yes, absolutely. She really does, although she's often discouraged. She's discouraged when, for example, last winter, when the US Republicans withheld $60 billion in aid for 6 months on orders from Donald Trump from October until April. And the Russians were firing 10 artillery shells for every 2 Ukrainian artillery shells. It doesn't feel good.
I want to ask you about that in a moment, about kind of the geopolitical changes, including in the White House. But just before we leave this part of the discussion, the title of the book, it's something you and I have discussed a little, How Good It Is, I Have No Fear of Dying. Can you tell us a little bit about it, what it means to you, how you came to name the book after that term?
Well, when I was interviewing Yulia about her father, who died on the Maidan, as I told you, she said that when they looked in his wallet after, when they found his, well, actually he's lived for a day or two in a coma, but in his wallet he had a photograph of Vasil Stus, who was a very famous dissident poet in Soviet Ukraine and died in a Soviet labor camp in 1985. And I said, well, tell me more about this poet. And I was either Yulia or Nazar kind of chimed in and said, how good it is, I have no fear of dying. And I said, what's that? And they said, that's the first line of his most famous poem. And every Ukrainian knows this poem. And someone had given her father a book of Stus's poetry when he was in hospital earlier that year. So one day I was looking hard for a title. Jonathan remembers how we were looking for a title. And I was walking down Abbey Street in Howth and liked the idea to do the book. It just popped into my head. So I had 2 inspirations for this book. And one was to do the book, and the second one was the title. And I sort of raced back, and I think I called Jonathan. He said, well, he liked it, but he thought it was a bit long. The publisher thought it was too long. They talked about making it just no fear of dying. And I said, no, you lose that oxymoron between good and dying. And for me, it really summarized the whole war, because Yulia's husband, Ilya, who was killed in a bombardment in 2018, had no fear of dying. Her father, who took his own life to make a political point, had no fear of dying. She has no fear of dying. I've heard her asked many times in interviews, are you really not afraid of dying? She said, no, absolutely not. I'm not afraid of dying. I was quite moved this morning in the Irish Times. I read the story of Robert Deegan, an Irish soldier whose funeral was held, I think, on Sunday. And he had, the first time he was in Ukraine, he lost an eye, and then he went back to fight again, and this time he was killed. And one of his relatives said he had no fear of dying. And to me, this is emblematic of all of those who are fighting, but actually of all the Ukrainians who are still there, who've stayed in Ukraine and who are defying the Russians.
And in keeping with that powerful message, Lara, the last kind of abstract question I'll put to you, we were talking briefly before about objectives. And you've written millions of words, so I'm sure each project you approach differently. But did you have a specific objective when writing this book? Do you usually have an objective when setting about on a writing project? And if you did, what was the objective of this book?
Initially, well, I enjoy writing books. So first of all, it was for my own benefit, just to, as you've got to do something with your life, haven't you? But initially, I wanted to tell Yulia's story. I thought it was an incredible story, a very powerful story, and I wanted to tell her story. By the time I finished the book, I hoped that it would influence public opinion, that it would change, if it just changes one person's mind about Ukraine, because I encounter constantly in France, even in Ireland, this basically Russian propaganda, which is that NATO provoked the war, that, I could go on, but I'm sure you've all heard it. And I came to believe that, this war is really, really important for the future of the world, and people need to support Ukraine. So I don't want to sound messianic about it or anything, but I really hope that this book will convince a few people of that.
And you spend time, obviously, between here and Paris, I'm right to say?
No, I wrote...
No, not just you personally, you spend time in the two cities, yeah?
Yeah, I have an apartment in Paris and a little house in Howth, and for the 27 years when I was a staff correspondent for the Irish Times, I would basically spend Christmas, Easter, and a few weeks in August in Howth. But I've written all my books in Howth. And to do this one, I actually spent 7 months in Howth, which is the longest time I've ever spent there. So I find it much easier to write in Howth than in Paris.
And proximate to the sea, maybe.
It's the proximity to the sea, the morning walks out to the lighthouse, but also the fact that aside from the walks, there's nothing to do.
Except be inspired, But no, I ask you, it was a personal question, but I'm just curious. I'm always really interested in threat perception, because I'm able to spend time in different parts of Europe, and it's just so abundantly clear the closer you get to the east. I spend a good portion of my year in Eastern Europe as well. And just the closer you get to the conflict, the kind of urgency of the conflict is so much more vivid.
I had a Georgian lady cab driver on the way here today, and she's very distraught about the way Putin has infiltrated the political class in Georgia, and the way he's basically trying to take over Georgia the same way he's basically doing now in Georgia by getting a puppet as president, what he had done in Ukraine with Yanukovych from 2010 to 2014. So yes, you're further away from it, but sometimes it comes to you. And actually, I know some of the Ukrainian refugees living in Howth. So you don't really escape it. And I think that anyone in America or Europe who thinks that we can escape it is wrong, because we will feel the effects of it.
that's one of the services of your book for an Irish audience, because even people who are, I think, sympathetic to the Ukrainians, needless to say, I'd say the vast majority of Irish people, the sort of book you've written and the kind of personal anecdote and the personal elements of it is very helpful, I think, in contextualizing the conflict in a way I think is worthy of a read. Two little questions from me. Well, short questions that will invite long answers, then over to the audience so you can start gathering your thoughts. Geopolitically, the return of Donald Trump to the White House. And just to save you the time, I'll put another question to that as well. What's the significance of that, first of all, for the conflict in Ukraine, but also the arrival of the North Korean troops? Do you have anything to say about both of those manifestations?
I'll do the easy part first. Is that the North Koreans arrived in October, and they are seen as Putin's response to the invasion of Kursk by the Ukrainians, because every time somebody does something, the other side does something else that ratchets it up a bit. Like when Biden gave permission to the Ukrainians to use ATACMS missiles against Russia, then he fired the intermediate range ballistic missile. I think we'll talk about that later. But so the North Koreans were sort of revenge. And until now, my understanding is that they're all deployed in Kursk, although the Ukrainians claim some of them are in Donbass. I don't know if they're in Donbass. They may be. And it also is because of a shortage of manpower, because Putin, even though his population is 3 times the population of Ukraine, he doesn't want to do a general mobilization. If he drafts every able-bodied Russian man, he's going to have problems. He's afraid of opposition and difficulties in Russia. So if he can use North Koreans instead, great. And he's got, but it also means, in some senses, this is already a world war. When you've got North Koreans fighting in Ukraine or in Russia, that's something. Donald Trump, I am not optimistic because of his statements until now. Yulia and I talked a lot about this when she was here in October. She says, well, Trump is very unpredictable. First of all, we have to respect the will of the American voters. Trump is so volatile, you have no idea what he's going to do, and we'll fight anyway. If Trump won't help, if the Americans won't help us, maybe the Europeans will. And in any case, we'll keep fighting. I'm not so optimistic because Trump has said over and over and over again, I'll solve it in 24 hours. And the only conceivable way of ending the war in 24 hours is basically freezing the lines where they are, and that he gives the impression that that's what he's going to do. Elon Musk, who's his great buddy now, made a peace plan in September of 2022, so-called peace plan, which was basically all of the Russian demands. Neutrality for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot join NATO. So one is not terribly optimistic. It looks like now his plan is to tell the Russians and the Ukrainians, look, you have to make peace. If the Russians refuse, then he will give more weapons to the Ukrainians. And if the Ukrainians refuse, he will stop giving them weapons completely. Trump is totally transactional, but it's going to be very simplistic, in my opinion, and not a just peace for the Ukrainians. And if that's the case, it's only a matter of time until the Russians try to take more, until they go for Odessa or Kharkiv or Kyiv. The Ukrainians want solid security guarantees. They want to be like West Germany was in NATO when East Germany was in the Warsaw Pact. They want, and they recognize now, and this is a big change this year, because last spring when I finished the book with Yulia, she was saying, we're not going to get the occupied territories back. And that was a heresy at the time. Nobody else was saying that. And now you have high-ranking government officials recognizing that they're not going to get them back. Well, they always add the proviso, we'll get it back later diplomatically, and she points out the Soviet Union, had Ukraine for 70 years. East Germany was occupied from, let's see, what was it, like 40 years? So the feeling is we'll get it back eventually when the regime changes in Russia or whatever, but we realize we're not going to get that territory back now. I think Trump's probably greatest shortcoming in this whole process. I mean, it seems quite simple. Okay, you freeze the lines where they are. The Russians occupied 20% of Ukraine, but the real catching point is going to be the security guarantees. And Trump does not want Ukraine to be allowed to join NATO. And he definitely does not want to send US soldiers to Ukraine. So what guarantees do they have that Putin's not going to come back for more? They have none whatsoever.
It's a perfect preface to my last question before turning to the room there. It's an impossible question, but do you know what success would look like for Lieutenant Mykytenko? And can Ukraine win, whatever winning means, notwithstanding what you've said there about the difficulties around the occupied territories for now? Is there a version of events where Ukraine wins in your view?
If there were, I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, if NATO and the EU and Donald Trump all agreed suddenly, this is too important, we can't let Ukraine be defeated, and we're going to support that, we're going to give them everything they need, and they can use our weapons against Russian territory, and we'll close the skies, which was what Ukraine was asking for initially, that the Americans and NATO would do what they did for Iraq under Saddam Hussein, for heaven's sakes. It shows it can be done. Use their Air Force and their air defense capabilities to stop Russians bombing, stop these glide bombs are doing horrific damage and killing a lot of people. And so, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So that would be victory. The consensus now is that Ukraine is losing the war, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think the best they can hope for now, they want it to end. There's really a thirst for peace because they're exhausted. They're absolutely exhausted. And Yulia will tell you she's exhausted. They've been fighting almost 3 years with very little time off in extremely hard conditions. And they want peace. The problem is that Putin shows no indication whatsoever of wanting peace, and he says they will not compromise. The Russian government spokeswoman just last week said, "Why should we compromise?" And they refer to the new Russian regions, right? All this land they've stolen, 4 oblasts of Ukraine. So yeah, I think the best the Ukrainians can hope for now is to freeze it now, not to lose any more territory than they already have, and some kind of guarantee, whether it's NATO membership or there was talk of French and Polish soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, although the Poles then said they wouldn't send soldiers. So that's not clear. Some sort of guarantee. The problem is they had a guarantee called the Budapest Memorandum when they gave up their nuclear weapons in 1994. And Russia, the UK, the US, France, I think China later as well, all these, but the main ones were the UK and the US and Russia, all promised Ukraine that they would protect it against any military aggression. And so now the country, Russia, which promised to protect them, has invaded them and is raping and torturing and killing and bombing, and so it was absolutely worthless. As Yulia says, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So they're very wary of any guarantees or so-called guarantees they're going to get now. really
sobering and really authoritative as ever, Lara. We've only tipped on, there's loads of other topics I think we could discuss, and they may come out in the Q&A, but we'll have a chance at the end to come back to anything that you feel is left unsaid.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.